All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome you for the annual Stone Center Lecture on Global Wealth, Gender, and Carbon Inequality. It's a pleasure to see so many of you here, and we have an even larger audience online, including Jim and Kathy Stone, who are joining us from Boston, and who are so generously supporting the activities of the Stone Center. Thank you very much, Jim and Kathy. Our speaker today is Lucas Chancel, co-director of the World Inequality Lab. He's coming here to present truly fundamental work that he conducts in Paris as co-director of the World Inequality Lab. The World Inequality Lab, under the leadership of Luca and Thomas Piketty, and thanks to the work of dozens of scholars in many, many countries, is producing what you could call a truly public good. It's a global database of income statistics, wealth inequality statistics, gender inequality, carbon emission, that follows the highest scientific and statistical standards. And this is what is going to make possible hundreds of research papers in the years and decades to come on inequality, to better understand the sources of rising inequality, to better understand the potential solutions to this problem. And the work has very much already started. Many studies have been conducted in recent years, and they are summarized most recently in the World Inequality Report 2022. And this is what Luca is going to talk about today. So please join me in thanking Lucas Chancel for being here today.
Thank you very much, Gabriel, for the introduction. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be here today, to be here in person. After many months of Zoom conferences and Zoom meetings, it's always great to feel everything that happens in conference rooms, and indeed interactions and exchanges are much easier in this context. So if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. I think there's some time towards the end of the conference to do that. But also, if at some point you would like to raise your hand and ask about a specific point, I think this is also what being back in physical presence can make possible. So this conference is entitled Global Wealth, Gender, and Carbon Inequality, New Findings from the World Inequality Report. What's interesting here is that I did another presentation, which was more of a book talk, but the funny part is that it was also a Stone Center book talk, but from another Stone Center on the East Coast of the USA. So I had the Eastern moment, and I'm very happy to be here now for the Western part of the US Stone Conference. Here in Berkeley, and I would like to thank the organizers of the event, Jim and Kathy Stone, and also of course Emmanuel and Gabriel for the invitation. So what I will be talking about today is mainly three different parts of this presentation. The first one, which Gabriel referred to a minute ago, is really why we're doing all that, why we are producing what we hope to see as, what we would like to see as a global public good, that is inequality data. Why are we doing that? Why we are spending so much time as researchers producing this information, which many people could say, this should be the job of statisticians. Why researchers are producing that, this is what I will talk about in the first part of this presentation. Then I'll say a few words, I'll spend some time talking about what we've learned from this project, what we've learned from the latest research on income and wealth inequality. What is the level of wealth inequality in today's world? What have been the dynamics over the past few years, over the past few decades? And also now we're able to go back 2 centuries backwards. So what do we learn from that, from a substantive perspective? And the third part of the talk will be about exploring the new frontiers of global inequality research with 2 topics here, one on gender and the other one on carbon inequality. I'll say a few words on gender, and there will be much more in the World Inequality Report for all those of you who are interested in this work. In the interest of time, however, I'll focus a little more on the carbon part here, in part because this is also the topic of a book that I wrote a little before the World Inequality Report, and on which the World Inequality Report also largely relies. So carbon injustices will be, in fact, the third big part of this presentation. So let me get straight into it. So this is the cover of the World Inequality Report. So it was edited with Thomas Piketty, but also what Gabriel didn't necessarily mention is that himself and Emmanuel's are also co-editors of this report. So this really is a truly collaborative project with basically 2 big pillars in this project, which is the Paris School of Economics and also this hub here of inequality research in Berkeley. So this report, you can already find it online, and we see it really as the first systematic assessment of global income, wealth, gender, and carbon inequality over 30 years. All the data sets, all the resources used to publish this report are available, open access online. This is part of our work to try to open up economic research, to open up these findings so that they can benefit all those who are interested in them. As I said a little earlier, third part of the presentation will be on another book, which is, so this book published Harvard University Press 2020, and where I get a little more into the understanding of the complex set of interactions between the environment and between inequality. And basically the key message here is that more unequal societies are societies where it's more difficult to tackle the environmental challenge. And to tackle the environmental challenge in unequal societies, this requires a radical rethinking of how we do social policy and how we do environmental policy. I'll say a few words on that later on. So let me start with the first point of this presentation: inequality data as a public good. The starting point is that inequality is everywhere, but still missing from most public statistics published across the world. So we know about inequality from these leaks that have been happening over the past 15 years. Every year, every 6 months now, you have these new sets of leaks which tell us about tax evasion, huge inequality in different parts of the world. We know also about these rankings, Forbes rankings, the Bloomberg rankings, which show this rise of billionaire wealth, social movements, which also tell us about rising inequality. But when you look at public statistics, you often don't see the rise of billionaire wealth. You often don't see the stagnation of big chunks of the population when it comes to income or to wealth. Or you do see it, but not as systematically, as precisely as we should be able to see it in order to really design effective policies to target what's happening, to tackle what's happening. And one of the problems with that is really a basic accounting issue in democracy. If you're not able to tell precisely who is benefiting from economic growth and who isn't, then it's very hard to design, review public policies and economic policies. And it's very hard to basically do our basic duties as citizens, which is to say, whether we want this or that government to be continued in office if we're not able to evaluate its economic policies properly without this data. So the data we're producing really tries to distribute economic growth to make it possible for everybody in a society to know who is benefiting from economic policies and who's losing from that. This work, in fact, originates a few decades back. First, in the pioneering work of Kuznets in the 1950s, looking at the evolution of inequalities, mobilizing tax data, combining this with national accounts to understand over a long time span what is happening to top income groups or top wealth groups in the economy. This work was also carried out by Tony Atkinson in the late 70s. And then the project was restarted, at least the modern version of this project was restarted by Thomas Piketty in the early 2000s, along with Emmanuel Saez, and then a growing number of researchers, surely from all places in the world. Facundo Alvarado, Gabriel Zucman, and many dozens and dozens of scholars contributed to the Top Income Shares project, which led to the creation of the World Top Income Database in the early to mid 2010s. This project is essential for the work that I'm going to show after, but was not sufficient, in the sense that we were just looking at top income shares. Wealth was largely missing from the analysis, and we were also not necessarily looking at all forms of incomes that individuals might receive. And so from the mid-2010s onwards, the project was enlarged, and it started to focus not only on top income groups, but also on the bottom of the distribution. So what is happening to inequality within the 99%? Looking at what we call fiscal income, whatever is visible on tax receipts, but also non-fiscal income, some forms of capital incomes, dividends that may not necessarily show up in the tax data, in the information that was initially mobilized in this project. In order to have a more holistic, a more comprehensive view of really how the totality of national income, of economic growth, is distributed, is shared to different groups of the population. And this led to the creation of the World Inequality Database. So looking at income, at wealth, really from the most macroeconomic perspective possible, and distributing this to each group of the population. I won't get too much into the methodological details today, but all these details are summarized in the Distributional National Accounts Guidelines, which are really the scientific contribution, the methodological contribution of this project. And this document indeed involves dozens of researchers as well. Maybe 2 points that I'd like to mention here is that what we call DINA, so Distributional National Accounts, really tries to use the strength of all data sources. So tax data, national accounts, but also rich lists, leaks. We try to make the most of the strength of each of these data sources. And we develop a flexible approach to combining these sources together, an approach that is able to accommodate for very different data contexts. In certain countries, like this country, in the US, there's more data available than in many lower income countries of this world. But we still try to produce estimates and numbers for all countries in the world, factoring in the different types of difficulty in accessing these different sources of data. We try to do this always in a transparent and systematic manner. It's also a cumulative and collaborative process. By this I mean that we always welcome new researchers, new colleagues to come in the project and to help us to improve all these series. So we really see this again as a collaborative public good, in which, in fact, more than 100 researchers have contributed since the beginning of the project, and I won't be able to name all of them. Some of them are here in the room today, but really it's in fact on a more personal note, it's a truly fantastic adventure to be part of a research project which is as collaborative as this one. Very often, people see research as a very solitary work, and in fact, in this project, we see really the power, the strength of working with this strong level of collaborations with colleagues. Talking about collaborations, what we've been doing over the past 5-6 years is really trying to strengthen institutional collaborations. Why we're doing this? Well, because at some point, we would really like that this work that is done here is not done by researchers anymore, but by public institutions, by statistical agencies whose, ultimately should be their job, basically, to publish this kind of statistics. So we've been developing strong partnerships with, in particular, the United Nations Development Program and United Nations Statistics Divisions, because it is this very institution that, ultimately should take over this kind of project. And this is what was done, by the way, for GDP. GDP was initially developed, invented by researchers, Kuznets, Keynes, among others. And, by the end of the 1940s, early 1950s, then the UN took over and then standardized these concepts. And it's largely because of the role of the UN that GDP has been playing this fundamental role in how, policymakers have been seeing the economy since then, since the beginning of the 1950s. So that's why we developed these partnerships also with national statistical agencies at the country level and partner institutions. This really is, there's a very wide ecosystem now of researchers focusing on inequality, and we're faced with common challenges. That is the heterogeneity of data, the lack of common standards to track different forms of incomes, different types of wealth. But we have common goals. And these goals really is, how will the public data system of the 21st century look like? And our answer to that is, so the World Inequality Database, www.wid.world, where we now cover, more than 140 countries with aggregate and distributional income and wealth estimates, and with also novel estimates on gender and carbon inequalities, as Gabriel was mentioning earlier. Okay, so that's for the what we do and how we do it part, and why we do it. And now, what are we learning from this work? It's not just about collecting data, it's also trying to understand about, what is happening and essentially also what we can do about it. So what have we learned from recent research on global income and wealth dynamics? I'll start with this graph, which tells us about the level of the concentration of income and wealth across the world today. So here we have these three key indicators: the share of income accruing to the bottom 50% of the population, to the middle 40% of the population, and to the top 10% of the population. Same thing for wealth on the right-hand side of the graph. So in a perfectly equal society, the bottom 50% of the population would get 50% of the total. The top 10% would get 10% of the total. In a perfectly unequal world, the top 10% would get 100% of the total. So in terms of income, what we observe at the global level is a top 10% capturing about half of the total, and the global half of the population making around a little less than 10% of total income. So that's a important, substantial level of inequality, of income concentration at the world level. But looking at wealth, and this might not necessarily be a surprise to many of you, the level of concentration is even starker, even more important, whereby 10% of the population own about 3/4 of the total, and a half of the world population owns close to nothing at all. What is, I think, important to reveal beyond these global numbers, these global statistics, is what is happening within countries and between world regions. And this is where the interesting parts come in. Because looking at the diversity of inequality regimes across the world tells us about what we can do and perhaps what we should not do if we want to contain, to limit inequality. So this is income concentration across world regions, where you see to some extent a wide diversity of inequality regimes. Look at Europe, for instance, where the bottom 50% of the population gets about 20% of total income. This is to be contrasted with North America. The bottom 50% of the population gets a little more than 10%, 13% of the total, significantly less than in Europe. And in the most unequal regions of the world, poorest half of the population, less than 10% of the total. So the most unequal regions of the world we see here have a level of inequality that is to some extent comparable to the world as a whole, if we compare this graph with the previous one. But what I'd like to stress here, one of the key messages, is the diversity of income inequality regimes. And I'll say a few words in a minute about the fact that we've also observed over the past decades a diversity in the trajectories followed by these different regimes. And this can teach us a lot of important things about policy. Talking about policy and how to tackle inequality, one of the new findings of the World Inequality Report 2022 is this focus that we place on looking at inequality before taxes and after taxes. And what this graph tells you is so basically the gap between the average income of the top 10% of the population divided by the average income of the bottom 50% of the population. And on the horizontal axis, you have this gap measured before taxes. On the vertical axis, you have this same gap, the same indicator, but measures according to income after taxes. And what you see here is that the line is all the dots, so all the countries in the world follow this close to straight line. What does this mean? This means that a big part of the differences in inequality levels that we observe across the world, across countries, after taxes, are actually already there when we look at inequality before taxes. So this is pretty important. This means that pre-distribution policies are very important, very significant to determine what is going to be the inequality level in a country versus another country. By pre-distribution, I mean minimum wage, regulations, but also public services and access to public services. I think this should be understood, looked at in the context of what we've also said before, what we've said earlier in this project about the role of taxation, the role of progressive taxes. And in fact, the two messages are not contradictory at all. Because to finance public services, to finance equal access to health, to education, to transportation, to culture, you need a decent amount of public resources. In order to finance these public resources, you need taxes and you need progressive taxes. I'll come back to that a little later on. But this really is about understanding the joint role of pre-distribution mechanisms and redistribution mechanisms, i.e. progressive taxes, in our understanding of these inequality regimes. I'll come back to this a little later on. Now, let me turn to wealth inequality. When looking at income, we observe that some world regions are doing it a little better than others with being able to contain income inequality. When we look at wealth, well, in fact, all regions are doing it pretty bad. Look at the share of wealth owned by the bottom 50% of the population. In all regions of the world, this is actually lower than 5%. So basically, the poorest half of the population, no matter which country you look at in the world, owns close to nothing. 2%, 3%, maybe 5% in some European countries. But still, this share is extremely low. So if there's one thing that we learn here from this new data, this new global wealth inequality coverage, is the fact that wealth inequality is extreme everywhere, and there's a lot of work to be done, not only in emerging countries, but also in the very rich world. So that's for the picture today. What have we learned about the dynamics, about the evolution of income and of wealth inequality? I'll say a few words on income again to start with, and then I'll move to wealth in a minute. So this is the share of national income according to the top 10% of the population in some of the world key regions. And what you see here is that, we have here regions or countries that have very different ways to organize their political systems, their economic systems, their social systems. But in the 1980s, in terms of the concentration of income, there was a relative homogeneity in these throughout these regions. And what is very striking here is that inequality seems to have been rising in most places, all of these regions here, but at very different speeds. And we we discuss this at length in the report, but these differences are very important for our understanding of inequality because they reveal the impact, the role of policies. Looking at such divergences in trajectory makes it very difficult to say that the rise of inequality is actually due to tech or is actually due to globalization per se. It has much more to do with policy choices, taxation choices, choices in terms of the regulation of the labor market. So policy matters, and it matters substantially. I'll skip this graph in the interest of time, and I'll move now to wealth inequality and to the dynamics of wealth inequality since the 1990s. This, again, is a new result from the World Inequality Report 2022. We're not able to produce these kinds of estimates in previous reports. And what we observe is, along with the rise of income inequality, a very strong rise of wealth concentration worldwide. So this kind of graph was popularized by colleagues, including Branko Milanovic and co-authors. So what you have on this graph on the vertical axis here is the total global population, ranked from the poorest on the left to the richest on the right-hand side of the graph. For each of these percentiles of the world population, what the vertical axis shows you is the per adult annual growth rate in wealth, net of inflation. So what is the rate of growth of your wealth? And what this graph shows is this, three sides to globalization, so to say. One, a globalization that is associated to a relatively positive picture, so that's a rise in wealth for percentiles towards the middle of the global wealth distribution, percentile 40 to say percentile 70 to 80. So that's the rise of emerging country, the rise of the emerging middle class, where wealth has been growing at 4% per year on average over this period of time. So that's a substantial increase. Another side to the story here is the relatively negative side to globalization. So the compressed middle class in rich countries with wealth growth rate lower than 3% per year, in some countries even much lower. And then the third side to what has been happening over the past 30 years, the very positive development for a very small group of the population. So wealth growth rate of 6%, 7%, 9% per year on average. So that's a substantial growth over time, substantial growth which translates indeed in rising shares for the top 0.1% or the top 0.01% in total wealth. So that's what you see on this graph. Red curve on this graph shows the share of wealth captured by a tiny group of the population. That's about 50,000 adults today. The top 0.001% of the population, from about a little more than 3% of the total to more than 6% of the total. So a doubling of its share in total wealth. Whereas at the same time, what happened to the bottom 50%? Well, close to no rise at all. Remember, they have been capturing just 2% of total wealth growth over the period. So why did it happen like that? Why has the distribution of wealth growth been so unequal over the years? One of the answers, one of the reasons that we also discuss more at length in the report is it's these fundamental dynamics that were happening here. So this is a development based on the earlier work of Gabriel and Thomas on the fact that private capital is coming back. It's rising. So nations are becoming richer. Capital is rising back, but governments are becoming poor. And the wealth of governments is actually the wealth, at least in democracies, of people who don't own wealth. The wealth of government is the wealth of those who do not have assets of their own. So public services, public enterprises, which in many countries have been sold by governments to the private sectors, sometimes at low cost, and which also contributed to this rise of private capital, of private wealth. Another reason behind the decline of public wealth here is the rise of public debt. But what is very important here is two things. First, the rise of private wealth is really a sustained, a very strong here trend that we observe, and despite moments of booms and busts of real estate bubbles or the dot-com bubble in some countries, you still do see this continuation of the rise in private wealth. And the other key important point that I'd like to attract your attention to is in some rich nations, namely the UK and also this country, net public wealth, so that's the total value of assets owned by the government minus its debts, is close to zero or below zero. When we express this as a share, as a percentage of national income. What does this mean? This means that if the US government wanted to repay all its debts by selling all its assets, so all its roads, all its infrastructure, all the schools that may still own, perhaps not that many, but if it wanted to sell everything to private individuals, it would not even be able to repay all its debts. And then US citizens would live in a country where any kind of infrastructure would be held by private hands. Any kind of infrastructure would need to potentially be entered with paying a fee. This is this very important, I think, takeaway from this kind of result. Let me check the time. Okay, so this is the some of the results that you'll find in the World Inequality Report for the recent period. A novelty from the report is that we're now able to go back 2 centuries backwards, thanks really to the whole set of new studies that were done over the past years on the long-run evolution of income inequality in India, in Russia, in Brazil, in South Africa. So we initially had some studies of the like for Western countries. And over the past few years, we're able to develop these studies looking at tax data, for instance, in India, starting at the late 19th century. So we're now able to produce these new results about global income inequality over the past 2 centuries. And the key here, takeaway, I think, is the following. So here we're back to this indicator, which I referred to once earlier. That's the ratio of the average income of the top 10% of the population to the average income of the bottom 50% of the population. But now that's at the global level. What we observe on this graph is a strong rise of this gap. Let's call it the top 10, bottom 50 gap between 1820 and 1900. So that's the rise of Western imperialism, and that is the strong rise of inequality between countries that's happening at this period of time. What's happening after, between 1900 and today? A lot of upheavals, a lot of important dynamics, shocks to the global economy, to countries. But the key point here is that the level of concentration of income in 2020 might be slightly lower than what we observed in the 1980s, but still is similar to the way incomes was concentrated at the peak of Western imperialism at the beginning of the 20th century. So the world is organized very differently today than 100 years back. Decolonization process happened, but what we show here is that we're still far from living in a world that's completely, from the economic perspective, completely out of the international hierarchies, economic hierarchies that were developed during the colonial system. And I think this is also an interesting takeaway and result from this part of the World Inequality Report of this year. With this other result here, which now is what? This graph is telling us about, when we think about global inequality, we may wonder what's driving it. Is it inequality between countries, or is it what's happening within countries? Is it inequality in average incomes between an average person in China and an average person in the US? Or is what's driving global inequality what's happening within the US? So between a very poor American and a very rich American, and similar in China. What this graph tells us is that we are back in 2020 in a world where most of global inequality is actually due to what is happening within countries. And on top of continued strong inequalities between countries. So what this graph tells us is that there are big inequalities between countries, but even bigger inequalities within countries today. Okay, so that's already a quite, I think, dense presentation so far, looking at these kind of two standards dimensions of income and wealth inequality. So made possible by these 2 decades of research on income and wealth dynamics, mobilizing tax data, national accounts, and rich lists. Now I'd like to turn to these new frontiers of global inequality research. And so I'll show you just maybe one result, one graph on the gender part, and then I'll try to move on to the carbon dimension. So on gender, maybe it's just to give you a taste on what you would find in the report, and happy also to discuss this more during the Q&A session. This is largely based on the work of Teresa Neef and Anne-Sophie Robillard, 2 colleagues that have been leading this work on global gender parity. What you have here is a new indicator to track gender inequities worldwide, and that really is the share of all labor incomes accruing to women at the world level. What we see is that women in 1990 get 30% of all labor incomes. This share has risen to a little less than 35%. So we're still very far from parity. That's 50%. And in fact, it would take about 100 years to get there. I won't get into this more, so I will skip these graphs. Maybe I'll keep them for the discussion for the time being, to try to save a little more time for this part on global carbon inequality, but happy to discuss the gender part in a few minutes. So turning to environmental inequalities, the question really is how we develop climate policies in an unequal world. So how we develop, deep decarbonization policies. We need to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050 in a world with the kind of inequalities that we've observed before. This is, as I was saying, also the topic of this book. The point is that climate, and some pictures to try to make this presentation a little lighter with a little less graphs. Graphs will come back in a few minutes, don't worry. But so climate policies blind to equity concerns are actually likely to fail. So what happened in 2018 in France, for instance, is a government that implements a carbon tax that puts a big part of the population to the street, saying that, well, actually, this tax doesn't look pretty equal or fair to us, and why would we pay it in a context where you're, putting this new tax on carbon at the pump, but you're not taxing kerosene for aviation. So as low or middle income individuals, working groups, we have to pay the carbon tax when we go to work, but rich individuals taking a jet from Paris to the French Riviera are not taxed at all on their carbon. And at the same time, this carbon tax was presented in the context of a larger tax overhaul through which large tax rebates, gifts were given to the top 1% of the population. So effectively, a transfer of tax money from low-income people, middle-income people, to the very rich. So this didn't work particularly well, and the tax was frozen. The reform was abandoned. This is not only about a French situation or a European situation. In countries like Indonesia, over the past decades, we've been seeing that kind of movements. So Indonesian governments wanted to remove fossil fuel subsidies in the 2010s. So effectively, this means hiring the price of fossil fuels, and this, put a lot of people out in the streets because low-income, middle-income groups were disproportionately impacted by these reforms. This is also visible in U.S. policy debates, at least in my opinion, my perspective. When you listen to why Donald Trump, how did he motivate his exit from the Paris Climate Agreement a few years back? This might indeed be a very cynical use of these tensions between inequality and the environment, but the fact that these tensions are used by some actors and echo and have some weight, some relevance for some citizens, some workers of certain industries is important. And what Trump was saying is that, well, climate policies are going to hit workers of some disadvantaged sectors of the country, of some mining sectors, and we need to protect them. We need to protect the American workers, and going big for the environment, at least as the Democrats want to do, is going to be bad for them. So we shouldn't do that. So here again might be a very cynical way to look at the issue from Trump's perspective, but there is a case to better understand what's happening, better understand what's at stake, and how to make sure that climate policies can cope with these inequality concerns. By the way, current chaotic events with the invasion, the war in Ukraine, as we've already started to see, are going to increase energy prices. So that's the oil price per barrel. So we're already very close to the price of crude oil, inflation adjusted, of the late 70s oil crisis. We're not yet at a level of the 2008 peak. We'll probably soon be there. So these tensions between the rise of energy prices, are we going to try to develop policy responses to that are going to protect the environment or not? That's really a question. I see a lot of governments in the world saying that we should kickstart coal again to try to make up for the lack of Russian gas, or that we should loosen regulations on fracking, for instance, again, to try to make up for the fossil fuels that we won't be able to import from Russia or Ukraine. So here we see again, potentially the exacerbation of tensions that we were going to see anyway in the coming decades by 2050, where the price of fossil fuels needs to increase massively if we really want to be able to solve the climate problem, the climate crisis. So what we're trying to do in the World Inequality Reports is first to present basic facts about the problem. And some of these basic facts, as simple as they may seem, are not necessarily discussed in many other publications. And so I'd like to, say a few words, a few points about these facts. So about, carbon emissions worldwide, who is emitting what today? And in order to understand the large inequalities in carbon emissions, I think we need to start with that kind of thing. So today, at the world level, every year, humanity is emitting about 50 billion tons of CO2, of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. According to our physicists and earth scientists friends, we have 900 such billion tons left if we want to keep global temperatures below 2 degrees. If we want to keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, we have just 300 billion tons left. So we're emitting 50 billion tons every year. So if we want to keep below 1.5 degrees, less than 10 years, about 6 years left. So that's why a lot of people say 1.5 degrees won't be possible today. So what does this mean in terms of what is our carbon budget? So that's what humanity as a whole. Now let's try to look at the individual level. And this is, by the way, what we're also always trying to do in this World Inequality Database project, is to try to reconcile macroeconomic approaches with microeconomic approaches, how the individual is important here. So if I split these two budgets, the 300 billion tons budgets or the 900 billion ton budgets, if I split it equally across the entire world population living between today and 2050, when we need to be at 0 tons of carbon. This means, according to the 1.5 degree budget, around 1.1 ton of carbon emitted per person per year. So that's the equally split carbon budget between now and 2050. Multiply this by 3, you get the 900 billion tons, so the 2 degree carbon budget's about 3.3, 3.4 tons per carbon per person per year. Where are we today? So that's per capita emissions by region. So at the world level, an average human being emits every year 3.6 tons of carbon every year. You see in green are two equally split budgets, right? 1.1 ton, 3.4 tons. North America, about 21 tons. So that's the average in this part of the world. Only 2 world regions here are close to our equally split budgets. Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia. By the way, do we have a good common understanding of what 1.1 ton of carbon is? For instance, what is the per capita carbon footprint of a trip, international transatlantic trip from, say, here to Paris? Anyone has an idea of that? Any guess? So that's 1.6 tons approximately, just one-way trip economy class. So you're already over the 1.5 equally split budget. You're slightly lower than the 2 degree, but if you do the return, then you've done your entire budget. Talking about carbon budgets, let's do the same exercise for per capita carbon footprint of a leisure trip to space. So this happened in 2020, right, during the COVID crisis. Indeed, it's related to what we were discussing before. So when you have so much wealth in the hand of very few individuals, they don't really know what to do anymore with it. And what they're doing is, so this is hard to estimate indeed, but so preliminary estimates, we're able to find that it's probably 100 or 200 tons of CO2 for just one ticket, one trip, 10 minutes. That's how much you emit with that kind of leisure activity. So the point is, there are very vast, very wide inequalities beyond these averages, right? Very wide inequalities in emissions. And that's what our new database makes it possible to track. So I'm back to our more standard indicators, the ones we've seen before, bottom 50% of the population or top 10% of the population. These are tons of CO2 emissions per person per year. So again, to be compared to our two budgets, or the 3.4 tons per person per year, if we want to stay below 2 degrees. Let's look at North America. So poorest half of the population is at 10 tons. Top 10% of the population is 73 tons. So this is for US and Canada. The point I want to make here is that, you have, if we look at East Asia, where China is going to play the overarching role, and Europe, you have very high emitters in middle or low income regions, and you can have low emitters in rich regions. So look at Europe, for instance. The bottom 50% of the population emits 5 tons of carbon per person per year. We're above the equally split 2-degree budget, the 3.4 tons equally split. But we're not that much over it. So the key point here is that carbon inequality is not just a rich versus poor country issue. There are very high emitters in poor countries and very low emitters in rich countries as well. In fact, today, there is more inequality with carbon inequality within countries than between countries. That's another key result of this report. Let me jump to this result, which I think is pretty important and significant. So this is a similar representation to the one I was referring to for wealth inequality, the elephant curve, so-called, of inequality and growth. So here I'm looking at the entire world population, ranked from the lowest emitters to the highest emitters. The smallest emitters on the left, highest emitters on the right. What you see is that a part of the world population is below the red line. So what this means effectively is that their emission levels, per capita emission levels, of a part of the population corresponding to low-income groups and middle-income groups in rich countries has been declining since 1990. So there has been a reduction in per capita footprints for some groups of the population in rich countries. This is a combination of two factors. One, economy-wide energy efficiency gains after the oil crisis of the 1970s, early 1980s, and two, the contraction of their income. So one factor is positive, the other one is not as positive at all. But the point is, they have been reducing their carbon footprints, whereas if you look at the top 1% of the global population, or the top 1% of the population in rich countries, carbon footprints have been increasing over the previous decades. And so I think, this is something that should be factored in how we think about, how we design climate policies. And so far, it is not often the case. Let me skip this slide in the interest of time. I was just saying here that there's now more emissions inequality within countries than between countries. And what I'd like to perhaps just recap what I've said so far. What I've shown is that there is a large level of income and wealth inequality at the global level. Income and wealth inequalities have been rising within countries. This rise of income and wealth inequality is also associated to a rise of pollution inequality. The wealthiest, the highest income groups pollute significantly more than other parts of the population. This is what we see in micro-level surveys when we really look at, the granularity of the data that's available. So this translates into large pollution inequalities in pollution. Now, what we also know is that the continuation of these trends in terms of pollution will further exacerbate the level of inequalities throughout the world. Climate change is going to exacerbate gaps in average incomes between countries. In fact, we've already been seeing this over the past decades. Low-income countries have already been hit hardest by heat waves that we've already observed. So if you want more about that, have a look at the latest IPCC Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. This impact of climate change on inequality is also true within countries. Within poor countries, low-income people are more exposed to heat waves, to other forms of climate-related negative impacts. This is true within poor nations, but also within rich nations. In a country like the US, low-income groups are often more exposed to environmental risks and also more vulnerable to these risks. Don't get me wrong here, we're all in the same boat when it comes to climate change. We're all exposed to climate change, but just not all in the same way. And perhaps one illustration of this, pictures are back, a caricatural but real way to illustrate this difference in exposure to climate change a few thousand kilometers eastwards of us is the Survival Condo Project in the Kansas desert, whereby with a couple of tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, you can buy this luxury, so to say, condo that would protect yourself from massive, climate stress. And so this is just to illustrate against the fact that in societies where parts of the population may feel that they can't protect themselves better than others against climate chaos, are societies that will have more troubles, more difficulties to move forward in implementing climate policies. So how do we protect the environment in an unequal world? Really, that is the key question here. For many decades, actually since the 1990s, the economics profession has been largely advocating a flat tax on carbon. And if you were, coming forward with this idea of a flat tax on carbon, a lot of colleagues would be, very, very positive about that. So yeah, let's bring back together the marginal private cost of producing, polluting goods with the marginal social cost for society as a whole. And if we equalize these two costs, we will reduce the quantity of pollution produced. The problem is that here there is this mismatch between this view of climate policies and how it can effectively be felt in the real world, whereby carbon taxation is actually often regressive. It's in particular the types of taxes, of carbon taxes that were implemented in practice without compensation packages for low-income groups have actually hit consumers without alternatives. So if the price of carbon increases at the pump, but you don't have public transportation alternatives, you cannot buy an electric car, so you have to choose between going to work or basically going to work but having to pay the carbon tax and being largely constrained then in your disposable income, or not going to work anymore. You won't pay the tax, but you won't have any income. And this is actually the situation that we have observed in many countries in the world. And here I'd like to come back on these graphs that I was presenting before, showing the inequality of emissions by, the poorest here, 50% in the US, emit half, the average levels of emissions. So the poorest 50% would be the groups that are the most impacted by policies such as flat tax on carbon at the pump. But the point is, and that will be what we'll see in the next graph, is that this group of the population is actually already at the level of emissions that the US has planned to be by 2030. So after the Paris Climate Conference, all countries in the world have established climate targets. So that's targets of, in 2030, where will we be on the road towards net zero emissions in 2050? So the US has established some targets, France established some targets, India, etc., established targets. These targets are never published, are never presented as per capita targets. They're always presented as economy-wide targets. But here I'm presenting these targets in per capita value so that we understand what this means. And this is, for the US, the 2030 targets effectively means 10 tons of carbon emitted per capita per year. And so this is actually the current level of emissions of the poorest half of this population. And so this is, this means actually a significant reduction for the middle 40%, the middle class, and the wealthy class in this country, who often are not particularly well targeted by climate policies. Would a tax on carbon really, be efficient, effective at limiting space travel? We can question this, and more particularly, flat taxes on carbon are not necessarily always the right solution here. So a key takeaway is that when we think about climate policy design, so either when we want to address how energy is produced, or how energy is distributed, that's the middle column, or how energy is used by end users, that's you and me at home, what kind of devices we have, we can have several types of policies, and we need to ask more and more about, are we targeting the bottom 50%, the middle class, the top 1% with the types of policy that we are implementing? I won't be able to discuss all these cells of the matrix, so have a look at the World Inequality Report if you're interested in that. What I'll just say, maybe a few final comments here. One is that there's another key dimension here, which is time. In some countries, implementing taxes on carbon might be relatively progressive, in the sense that if you have low-income or middle-income groups that have not yet adopted carbon-intensive lifestyles, then it's possible in these countries to tax carbon at the pump, for instance. You'll be targeting the top, the wealthiest part of the distribution. In 10 years, it might be too late. So that's a window of opportunity here. That's an important time dimension to add to this 3x3 matrix that I was presenting before. And another point to have in mind, I think, is some countries have actually done this relatively well. So no country is perfect, but just one example here in Indonesia, after failing, at their initial fossil fuel subsidy reforms that I was presenting at the beginning, the Indonesian government decided to say, okay, we will reduce fossil fuel subsidies, so that's extra cash for the government, and we will re-inject this cash to individuals through cash transfers for low-income groups and public service provision. So Indonesia developed a universal healthcare system which did not exist as such before this reform. So here you have an alliance between the ecological tax reform and some social service provision. So I think that's an interesting case where you can actually reconcile these two dimensions. In British Columbia, closer to us, a carbon tax was introduced in 2008, along with rebates and cash transfers to low-income and middle-income consumers. So exactly the opposite of what was done in France, for instance, where the money was used to basically give back checks to the top 1% or the top 5% of the population. So there are different ways to solve this potential tension. And what we propose in the World Inequality Report is to think also out of the box. For instance, so far we've always thought about carbon taxes on consumers. What about carbon taxes on asset holders, on those who actually are investing in different sectors of the economy, brown sectors, carbon-intensive sectors, or green sectors, so far there are very little financial incentive to invest in one or the other. And so a carbon pollution top-up, that is a wealth tax with an even higher rate if you invest in brown sectors, are also the types of solutions that I think we could think about before actual regulations and bans and proper impossibilities to invest in brown sectors after some points. Let me perhaps just end with this slide by saying that to tackle inequality, we need to think out of the box. We also need to learn from historical experiences. And I think, you know, what we've learned perhaps from the past 2 years is that, you know, with governments in the Western world have been, you know, putting together policy packages that were difficult to think about a few years before, with strategic planning of key sectors of the economy, with, you know, shutting certain countries or certain companies' access to to financial markets, to diverse from key assets and companies, track and size the assets of certain individuals. When we think about climate policy, and if we acknowledge the fact that climate change might also be a huge threat for global security, then it could become possible to envisage similar kind of measures, or kind of you know, ecosystem of measures to address climate change. And with Gabriel, Zucman, and other colleagues, we recently published a note, for instance, showing that it's going to be very hard to effectively track assets of Russian oligarchs if we do not have a proper financial asset registry. And so basically imposing effective sanction might also require the development of you know, new tools to actually track assets, where they are, who owns them. This can also be extremely useful in the decades to come when it comes to tracking investments in brown sectors of the economy. At some point, we'll be able to know, public authorities will be able to know who is continuing to invest into brown sectors, into carbon-intensive sectors in other parts of the world. So here, you know, it's very difficult to be optimistic about the current situation, but maybe we can try to learn from some of the policy developments, and to, if we have some pessimism of the mind, maybe add to that some optimism of the will here. In terms of the policy toolkit, there is a clear, you know, new realm of possibilities that I think is opening thanks to what we've seen over the past 2 years. And I'll just finish by saying that, to wrap up, in one word, what we learn in this report, in this body of work, is that inequality is essentially a political choice. It varies a lot, in fact, so much across countries and over time. There's no such thing as natural laws in economics. It's really about social policies, institutional choices. And in this context, it's extremely important for everybody to have access to transparent information about what's happening. And without that, we cannot have democratic debates on the economy. That's what we're trying to contribute in this body of work. And when it comes to the environment, the key message here is going to be that it's going to be very hard to decarbonize without important redistribution, to finance green investments for all, and to also address this specific issue of the very large carbon footprint of the very wealthy. I'll stop here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Luca, for an incredibly thorough presentation. So we have a bit of time for questions. Let's start with questions from the audience, and then we can take questions from the remote audience. And we'll circulate a mic if you want to say a few words. So, who wants to start? Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. It was great. I was wondering what could be the role of. Thank you. I guess it's working. I was wondering what could be the role of government planning in economic sectors in order to address the climate crisis or to plan different investments or things like that.
Thanks. I think there are very different ways to solve the climate crisis. One way would be to, for instance, from a purely technical point of view, what Musk is doing with Tesla is interesting. Basically, going big on a sector that needs to grow, the electric car. But at the same time, this, might be a very, a pretty inequality enhancing way. So the question of who is going to own these new sectors that emerge through the climate transition is actually key. So the issue of the ownership of the energy system, energy production, but also the distribution of energy, or the end-use devices that use this energy that is produced and distributed, is critical. Just perhaps one example. So Sweden today is the country in the world with the highest carbon tax. And actually, Swedes don't, worry too much about the carbon tax level. That's fine. Why? Well, largely because before the implementation of the tax in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Swedish local governments invested massively in the development of local heating systems. So basically, you have these forests harvested in a sustainable manner, transformed into local heat. So and so that's a local public ownership system that has been pretty efficient, and that's a government decision to do that. And the market was not didn't have enough foresight at the time to basically anticipate that. So that's one answer to I think to this question.
Yes. Just a second, the time that we bring the microphone.
Yes, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. So from what I understood, you believe that in order to address the climate crisis, changing climate policies would take a huge part. But from my understanding of America, lobbying and other private actors influence a huge amount of policy decisions. So I was wondering what thoughts you had on what would be the push required to actually enact those policies in the United States specifically, and also if you want to comment generally on global issues. Yeah.
I'll start with the first part of the question. I think a big part of the lobby is actually enhanced and made easier because of this, form of alliance between those who actually really don't care about climate and those who would care about climate but who care about their incomes and who care about their work. And so the more we leave the inequality question aside when we talk about climate policy, the more we make this alliance possible. And I think this is an alliance that really is making the whole situation much more complicated and will be even more complicated as decarbonization needs will become even stronger, even more salient. We're just at the beginning, in fact, of this road towards zero emissions. We've seen that in some of the graphs, right? So really, it's key when you look, for instance, at what has been the Democrats' proposals for climate change. I know there has been quite a bit of discussion here about Green New Deal policies. What does this actually mean for workers in sectors that will be impacted? Are we really sure that we're putting enough cash on the table to compensate these losers. You know, my fear is that what we've done in the 1990s, 2000s with trade, saying that, okay, let's open up to trade. There might be a few losers in this or that sectors. We'll take care of that, you know, as we go through, is that we repeat these kinds of mistakes. And I think this is really the kind of situation that will, you know, make lobbying against climate policies even really easier for these actors. So my contribution here, it's very minimal, but it's to say that climate policies without strong redistribution packages are likely to fail and to you know, be utilized by the lobbyists in the wrong way. The good news is that we know we can do much better than what has been done in this country, including in investments and infrastructures. I know it's also complicated because of, you know, the politics of this country, and I don't have an answer to solve the political polarization in the US. Sorry for that.
Hello. Thank you for a fascinating lecture. I wanted to ask a follow-up on one of your last points, because as you were talking about the carbon tax, you had the one graph that you showed about offshore wealth. And I think we pretty much know that companies and very wealthy individuals are very much against paying taxes and find ways with our Swiss cheese offshore system of international finance to avoid those taxes. You mentioned perhaps something like a ledger system or whatnot. If you could just expand on that and how we might come up with a carbon tax system that could be globally embraced or at least globally enforced. Anyway, any ideas you have on that would be very interesting.
Thanks a lot. I think, yeah, it's critical here. So I would say two avenues. One is what the EU has just started to sign up for. So that's carbon tax at the border of a region. So to prevent, you know, outsourcing polluting activities and then re-importing stuff, so benefiting from these, you know, advantages in lower environmental regulations in the rest of the world. But this won't be sufficient. I think that as we move on towards, you know, 2050, one thing will be key is to prevent rich individuals from Europe, from North America, to invest in a business that is polluting in other parts of the world, and that may not necessarily be shipped back to rich countries, but just business that is polluting. And to continue to make a lot of money and to generate some cash, some dividends, some income, some extra wealth, which can then be used wherever they want. And that's where I think that, you know, global asset registries are essential for tax purposes, for kind of standard tax purposes, wealth tax, income tax progressivity, but could become also essential to address this issue of who invests, how we prevent individuals from investing into these activities in the future.
Hi, thanks for a great talk. I've become very enamored with this distinction that you mentioned between pre-distribution and redistribution. So I'm hoping you can help me out with a couple of challenges with it, or that I've encountered with it. One is, isn't this distinction, or doesn't this distinction become very muddy when we start talking about actual policies? I mean, you mentioned government services, for example. Those could be very easily seen as redistributive as well as pre-distributive. And obviously tax, which I think it makes sense to look at as redistribution, but that's obviously what also finances pre-distribution. So is there any kind of any solution to that practical quagmire? And the other question is, even if the pre-distribution policies are kind of a more foundational driving force behind inequality, which I would agree with, isn't it possible that the taxation is still kind of the more expedient policy remedy? Thank you.
No, thanks. I think this is a fundamental point here, and I think the general message coming out from this report and this body of work is actually we need to think about the whole system here. And if we really want to tackle inequality in the way, for instance, that, Western European countries or the US was able to do between 1950 and 1980 is really this combination of taxes, progressive taxes, and investments in equal access to public services and regulations on the market. It's really this system, and if you remove one component, one element, the whole system collapses, because it's also, the rise of. I didn't have time to show this graph, but the rise of the social state in Europe or in the US, so rising investments in education, in health, in other basic public services, was actually done at the same time as the rise of progressive taxation. And the rise of progressive taxation was accepted because there was this counterpart. So they indeed go hand in hand. And of course, there's also a paper by Emmanuel here and Thomas Piketty and Stephanie Stancheva about the role of taxes in, yes, reducing, in redistributing, so in reducing inequalities post-tax, but also as soon as you think intertemporally, in reducing inequalities before taxes. So basically, if I have a very strong progressive tax today, this means that tomorrow I have less wealth to accumulate, and so day after tomorrow I have less capital income. So taxes are also one way to reduce inequalities before taxes. That being said, I think the difference between these two concepts have their limits, but can still be useful in our understanding of the key drivers of inequality. But bottom line, they go hand in hand. It's very hard to remove one component from the system.
All right, we have time for one more question. Yes.
Well, first, I'd like to join everybody else in thanking you for a wonderful talk. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry you were not able to put a lot of time into the gender inequality. And I had one question about the one slide you showed. If I read it correctly, it showed a rather abysmal increase in the percentage of women's income to men, for like 30% to 37% over close to a century.
34.7, so even less, yeah.
Worse, does that factor in the drastic increase in women in the workforce?
So, in fact, this is a simple indicator, but the novelty here is that we're really trying to have these two big dimensions of gender inequality together. That is the gender pay gap, which is often referred to as one of the leading indicators to look at gender inequality. But of course, if we don't combine this with the employment ratio, so how much women are actually in the workforce, then we might be missing a big part of the picture. So this indicator combines these two elements, and so I didn't have time to get into the specifics and the regional trajectories. But for instance, in European countries, what we observe is, since 1990, an increase in the employment ratio, so women are more and more in the workforce. But in terms of the earnings ratio, the gender pay gap, this is more or less stable. This is not necessarily what you observe in other regions of the world, but yes, we do take into account these two dimensions. And the bottom line is, I think in both dimensions, countries and rich countries also are clearly not being as fast as they think they are, and as fast as the realization of this problem that we've been observing of the past few years. Maybe here, just also one way to answer that is what we've been trying to do in this report is also to show where different facets of inequality can be articulated together, and when there can be some forms of policies that are able to address these different forms of inequality. So minimum wage policies, or policies to limit the level of precariousness in certain sectors of the economy, particularly would be policies that reduce income inequality, but also gender inequality, because we indeed observe an overrepresentation of women in highly precarized sectors of the economy. So here there's an alliance between inequality reduction and gender inequality reduction as well.
Thanks a lot. Thanks all for your presence. Great questions.
Thank you very much.
On behalf of the Stone Center, thanks also to Jim and Kathy Stone for their continued support. And most importantly, thank you so much, Luca, for a wonderful lecture.
And as we conclude, if you exit out this side, you'll go right into the reception if you'd like to stick around for some refreshments and conversation. Thank you.